Hello and good evening, and welcome to NYU Salon Series. I'm Sydney Boyd. I am a lecturer with NYU DC. I teach writing. I'm also an editor with the Federation of State Humanities Councils, and I'm delighted to be here with Vinod Busjeet, an author, poet, teacher, banker, and diplomat. Mr. Busjeet has many stories to tell. And in fact, when I met him a week ago, I could have talked to him for hours, but we will try to keep it to just 1 hour this evening. He comes to his first novel that we're talking about this evening after 29 years of work in economic development, finance, and diplomacy, and trips to more than 50 countries. He has worked as an international banker at the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation in Washington, DC. And he was born in Mauritius, a multiracial island in the Indian Ocean. This is where his novel is set. It's a story whose protagonist, Vishnu Bhushan, it's a classic Bildungsroman, an education, both personally, culturally, also politically, sexually, and academically. And when I talked to Vinod last week, I mentioned it, oh, this is a story about immigration. And he pointed out kindly, no, it's actually a story about emigration. It's a story about leaving home and not a classic coming to America kind of story. It's a novel about colonialism, family, tragedy, love, and coming of age in ways many of us can only imagine. And so I'm hoping tonight to start with this idea of emigration, not immigration, that's in the novel, and the factors that lead people to want to escape, but also the factors that make it hard to leave. So Vinod, why is this a topic you wanted to explore, and how have you seen others connect with it?
Yeah, well, first, let me thank you and NYU for hosting this event and for giving me the opportunity to talk about the novel Silent Winds, Dry Seas. So, a novel about emigration rather than immigration. In fact, I very rarely hear the word emigration used in America. Everyone talks about immigrants and the woes of immigrants and the problems they face in this country. And my novel is about what are the factors that led the narrator to want to leave Mauritius. And what I wanted to convey is that people don't emigrate just for one reason, but they are a complex, it's very complex, the issue of emigration and the factors involved. For instance, people picture Mauritius as a beautiful island, a paradise island with beaches and a resort where you go to special weddings and paradise. Life in the time covered in the novel, which is from 1949 to 1968, life was around the beach, the family, and around. However, if that is not enough for you, you want to leave. That's one thing. Then you also have the matter of what I call social and religious oppression. That is, if you don't abide by the norms of the society, or if you don't live according to certain religious principles, then you as an individual may feel unhappy. And so I explore in the novel those issues. Someone in Mauritius actually who read the novel said that I talk about what in French is called the dérive de la religion, which is the excesses of religion. Indeed, Mauritius is a very religious place where Hinduism is practiced, Islam, Roman Catholicism, Buddhism. That's sort of the multicultural part. So the novel is about, does it confine itself to sort of the joys of a multicultural society, the richness, it's a very rich, diverse country culturally. However, that comes with challenges. And so my novel explores that. And so, since we are talking of emigration to the US, what I have to tell this anecdote. I met I met various agents, but one agent read sort of the first 10 pages of my novel, and I was meeting with her, and she looked very unhappy. She looked at me and said, "Vinod, I want to see Vishnu's alienation in America." I said, "Well, my novel is not about alienation in America. My novel is about a narrator who feels alienated in Mauritius and wants to escape." So I guess to conclude on this issue, I'd like to quote from a reader, actually, from a Sri Lankan reader, who wrote an email to me and said, "It is somewhat refreshing to read a novel that tells about the homeland and how oppressive it can be, where getting out is a joy, not an exile." So coming to America is not always an exile.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I know, you want me to explain a bit more?
So I know that you must get this question quite a bit. The protagonist's name is Vishnu Bhushan. Your name is Vinod Busjeet. It is set in Mauritius. So this began as a memoir and evolved into a work of fiction. And of course, these are two separate genres and allow for certain kinds of freedoms in both avenues. And I'm curious, how did this change the story for you, or what you were able to do with the story by moving it into a work of fiction?
Oh, a lot of things. You can invent events, invent characters. You can fuse 4 or 5 characters into one. But I think, to me, the most interesting part of it was to manipulate memories from various time periods. And maybe the best way is to illustrate it from one chapter where I take a memory I have of my aunt confronting another woman. Then years later in New York, I come across the music album of Carlos Santana, Abraxas. And years after that, I read Hermann Hesse's novel, Demian.
Wow.
And I take those 3 memories and I weave a chapter out of it. A memoir would not enable you to do that, because a memoir, you'd have to first deal with those events chronologically. Second, I would have to deal with them separately. And here I am in one chapter, I made a story weaving those 3 memories together. So that's what fiction enables you to do. And in the one chapter where, the title of the novel is Silent Winds, Dry Seas. So it's a novel about a country, where the wind and the sea is present all the time. And so the cyclones are frequent. I have a chapter devoted to a major cyclone on the island. And in a course of 3 days, I compress events that actually took place over a year. So that's I don't say playfulness, but imagine, that's where your imagination, you can bring your imagination to bear.
Yeah. The novel does bring in quite a bit of history, but as you said, in this instance, you compress the timeline. One of these is Cyclone Carol, which occurred in 1960. That happens sort of towards the beginning of the book, and it's a fascinating scene to me because it combines um, ideas of family and climate and love and death and tragedy, also with immigration. And there's this conversation with Vishnu and his uncle and aunt and his parents, who I think are all sheltering in place, essentially, where his uncle Ram, who is a beloved character in the book, I think that's my interpretation. He says, "Oh, Vishnu, you need to go to England and get yourself an English woman," and then the end of this line, and I hope you don't mind me reading it. It says, he says, "This will improve the Bhushan stock and defile it."
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah, it's just, it combines so many aspects together. And I was hoping to think with you about how these things influence and underline each other in the shape of the narrative and these different configurations that you keep putting them in.
You know, it's not that I consciously attempted to do that. The reason all this came about together is that my approach to the novel was, don't start with themes. You know, I didn't start saying to myself, I am going to deal with colonialism, with ethnic identity, with family and all those themes. No, my approach was, you tell a story. And as you write the story, the themes will emerge. So as I wrote, the themes just emerged. And what happened was, in the course of writing the story, I realized that what you want to do is create a cumulative effect. So all these things, when they happen, you make them happen all at the same time, when those themes are all present, I would say, what's the word, when it's, it's the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Mm.
So those themes individually, if they stand on their own, if you want to deal with them individually, they won't have as much of an impact as when they all, come together in story. It's like it's developed what's organically. In fact, my advice to writers is, start with characters. Start, like you said, Uncle Ram is an interesting person. You start with that interesting person, and then action and dialogue will make that person not only come alive, but through him, themes will be expressed. Like
The writing teacher in me, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, like I think you're the first one who chose that passage about defiling, in defiling the blood. So I was there trying to address the issue of ethnic purity.
Mm.
So the point he was making is, we should not be obsessed with this idea of ethnic purity or religious purity. However, let us say I chose that as the theme. I said in the beginning of the writing, I said, I want to deal with that. The novel would have been a piece of propaganda. It would not be an interesting story. The way it is presented now, I think it's a story that people will enjoy reading.
That connects to the way, so in the novel, you weave prose together with poetry. And what you just said makes me very much think of poetry, which evokes ideas rather than sort of hit you over the head with them. And I'm curious now if the reason that you worked poetry into this novel is in a way to underline that this way of allowing the reader to arrive at a feeling and experience rather than very clearly spelled out, this is the theme, and just let the story sort of unfold.
Yeah, to me, literature should be an emotional experience, right? Otherwise, it becomes like an essay. It becomes, creative nonfiction. So indeed, my objective in writing is to instruct but delight at the same time. And how do you delight the reader is by writing in a way that the reader enjoys it, and poetry is one of the tools I have at my disposal. I view poetry and prose as tools that I have, and I use them when necessary. Yeah.
I'm also thinking too, you mentioned some music earlier, and at the end of the book, Rhapsody in Blue plays a key role in sort of this moment of realization. Again, without spelling it out explicitly, but this is the American sound, and here I have arrived in Gershwin's America. Did any of the same kind of thoughts occur to you about using music as a way to evoke without being, super explicit?
Yeah, I think music evokes a mood, right? When I write about Mauritius, when the narrator is in Mauritius, he's listening to the local Sega, or he's listening to sort of what was then called Bombay film music, not Bollywood, nice called Bollywood. So these are different moods, right? And so is Rhapsody in Blue. Also, the music, the piece of music, Rhapsody in Blue, is American in many ways, insofar as it is for its time. It was in classical music. It was a fusion of what Americans from Europe were used to, which is sort of classical music, but fused with jazz here and fused with Black American music and Native American music. So that's the idea. So music here reflects, in fact, reflects the narrator's development, because his musical education, from music that he heard in Mauritius, which was Bollywood music plus Western pop music. Then he comes here, he acquires a knowledge of American music. So it conveys a narrator's development as well as the environment in which he's operating. Yeah.
It also reflects and sort of mirrors, Mauritius is such a multiracial island of so many different cultures coming together. And just hearing you describe it, it clicked in my head that it's very much a subtle bookend of the narrative arc for Vishnu. To be hearing this at the end of the novel, thinking of where he came from too. That's beautiful.
I like the word bookend because the last piece, in fact, the novel ends with a reference to music, which is Simon and Garfunkel's Look for America. But I think Simon and Garfunkel also has a song called Bookends.
Yes, they do.
Yeah. So, and Simon and it was, in a way, I was paying homage to one of my favorite groups, duet, that is Simon and Garfunkel.
Oh, I'm with you right there. I'm a big fan of theirs. Something else towards the end of the novel. So here we are in DC, and Vishnu, the character, spends a few months in DC, and he goes to Hawk and Dove and all these places that I know.
Oh, yes. Unfortunately, Sans Souci has disappeared.
Yeah, that's one part of the book I read about and thought, oh wow, what a place. Did you draw from personal experiences? Food,
yes,
food and good wine?
Sans Souci now is a McDonald's. It's near the White House. It's a McDonald's. It used to be, yeah. That's one piece when it comes to the DC experience. The kitchen experience I never had. my kitchen experience, it's my, my wife that introduced me to the kitchen. However, the experience at the restaurant and the sort of the woman ordering this, fancy wines for which I had no money. That's real. That's real, and
Wow.
it's an instance of personal hubris. Trying to show off with means that you don't have.
Hmm. Apart from eating at fantastic French restaurants in DC and drinking amazing wine, I'm curious about these other parts of your life. You've had an incredible career in diplomacy, business banking, international politics. Uh, are there similarities that you found between those worlds and now this literary world that you are a part of?
Okay, when it comes to the literary world, I have to make a distinction between the world of writing and the world of publishing.
Hmm.
I was struck by how the world of publishing is very businesslike. Even the terminology they use. When it came time for the manuscript to become a book, right? They use the word production. Now the book will go into production, which is a term you will use in the world of business. They refer to the advertising material as assets, and assets and liabilities. That's a business term.
Hmm.
So the world of publishing is very much like it's a business. I mean, it costs money to produce a book and advertise it and go through various distribution channels. The world of writing is quite different. How much we have time. One of the first writing workshops I attended, I was in Vilnius, Lithuania, and there was a group there from Canada, mostly from Canada and the United States. There were people from Australia, South Africa, Korea, pretty international, but mostly Canadians and Americans. And two magazine editors talked about what they accept, what is the submission policy. And at question and answer Q&A, all those there was the very young writers asked questions. But to my mind, there's one critical question they missed. And I got up and asked the question. Mind you, most probably in that room, I was one of the 2 or 3 persons you could qualify as financially secure. Others, they were struggling writers. And I am the one who asked the question, how much do you pay? And everyone looked at me like, what kind of question he's asking? But, you have to get paid. And so one thing I learned, there's the writing world, many writers don't seem to, live in this reality, that, you have to get paid for writing. So that's one thing which kind of struck me. But I think when it comes to, let's say, the art of writing, the major thing I learned was first I have to get rid of the style that I had cultivated working for 29 years in business, economics, diplomacy, which was to write in a language that was grammatically precise, but kind of lifeless, bloodless. When you are writing, literature, you have to write, as I said before, you have to evoke emotional experiences, right? So then you have to learn to write, with your guts, not your brain. You write with your guts, or you write with your heart. That's an important difference between those 2 worlds.
When this book is undoubtedly beautiful in the way that you're describing it.
Thank
It
you.
feels
Thank you.
like that. But I also it also touches on so many historical events, like the riots, and we already mentioned the cyclones, which, are compressed but and elaborated on. But did you spend much time, doing research for this, or did you grow up knowing it? Did you draw from your own memories? How did you bring history into this novel of such beautiful experiential prose?
The research I did actually is mentioned in the acknowledgements. There were two books which I read. One was the history of the Coldstream Guards, which is sort of the Coldstream Guards are the personal sort of regiment that looks after the royal family. So I read their history because they were the ones who were dispatched to Mauritius during the riots. And the other one, I read one chapter which was written by the chief meteorologist of Mauritius, who worked for the British colonial service. And that was an interesting perspective, the perspective of this person who is not from Mauritius, but who is a technical guy recording, what goes on with respect to the weather in Mauritius. So that's the only research I did. Otherwise, it was my personal experience and my memories. But the word research is tricky. Like I constantly read about the history of Mauritius, but I don't read it with a view like research. I read it, I'm curious. I go to the dentist, in pre-COVID days, you have magazines, you read Architectural Digest. I'm curious about it. I'm not doing research. So it could just be the accumulation of knowledge over time shows itself in the novel. That's possible.
So there's a scene in the novel where Vishnu goes to a football game and somebody sort of really misconstrues where Mauritius is and what its history is. And it's one of the moments I thought, oh yes, now Vishnu has really come into his own, because he really, I'm shaking my finger. He really lays it down in this highly satisfying way. Is that, I'm also, I'm pressed to think of another novel I've read about Mauritius, and is the history of this place that clearly it's so important to you. Was that also part of your motivation for writing the book? And if so, how did that fit into thinking about the story that you told?
Most definitely, it was a major reason why I wrote the novel, was to, in a way, to bring Mauritius to the American consciousness. My editor, I told my editor very early on that I would like to put Mauritius on the kind of literary map, the English-speaking literary map. We are very much present in the French-speaking literary map. We produced, major writers in the French language, including a Nobel Prize winner. For a small island, not bad.
Yeah. As we are in the midst of more Nobel Prize announcements, yes. I'm also curious. So I'm so curious. I'm curious about many things. Before you wrote this novel, you had a screenplay titled Murder in the Gold Jungle, for which you're in search of a producer. Having written a screenplay and then moved to a novel, two very different places, two very different kinds of writing, I think, in my mind. How are you sort of thinking across genres that you might go into next?
No, I think my next project is, I have sort of parallel projects, a poetry collection, a novel about a slave rebellion, and a memoir about my daughter.
Hmm.
So, yeah, I'm not thinking of venturing into new ground. in in terms of type of writing. It's just not that much time. But I learned a few things in screenwriting. One is concision. When like you'll notice, I don't spend much time describing the physical characteristics of a person. The nose, the eyes, the ears, the lips, and so on. But you have some writers who are very good at it. I do it, that's screenplay technique, just a few brushstrokes, and that's what you have. Because when you write a screenplay, you want your character to be played by, more than one kind of actor. You don't want to be too specific in terms of physical characteristics. So that's one thing I adopted when I deal with my characters. And screenwriting teaches you dialogue. That dialogue should not be everything that a person speaks. You have to be selective in what you choose or what you make them say.
Hmm.
So you learn things.
I have a very distinctive picture in my mind of Uncle Ram. I'm realizing now. I know what he looks like in my head, but you haven't described him at all.
No,
Really.
I don't think physically I've said whether he had small nose, a big nose, or big eyes.
No, you
No,
don't.
I
Yeah.
don't. I don't spend much time on the sort of physical feature. I'll tell you one writer who is very good at that. It's Amitav Ghosh,
Mm.
an American, Indian American writer who does that very well. But
Are there other writers that you found that you sort of took inspiration from?
it's very difficult. I think only the reader can spot that, because my tastes in reading are quite varied and eclectic. To give you an example, I read Elena Ferrante, who is, Italian, writing, coming of age novels,
Mm.
about, two girls in Naples, right? Then you have Marlon James, a Jamaican writer who writes about these, this novel about women in rebelling, in slave rebellion. Then I like this David Mitchell writing about this the southern autumns of Jacob de Zoet, a Dutchman in 19th century Japan. So
Mm.
and then you have V.S. Naipaul. I mentioned Ghost before. I mean, so many. It's not that I don't read just one kind of book. So I it's hard for me to pinpoint influences.
All of the authors you just mentioned and the way that you describe them, they're rooted in place, in different places.
Yeah.
Um,
True.
and so, yeah, and both of the things, the Murder in the Gold Jungle, perhaps you can describe that very quickly.
That's it.
Is it another place?
Yeah, that takes place in the Amazon.
Yeah.
And I was inspired to write it after looking at the photographs of this Brazilian photographer, Sebastião Salgado, who is also I think a documentary filmmaker. And that inspired, it kind of, it, I was really outraged actually by the way the poverty in that part of Brazil, and the life of the miners, the gold miners in Brazil. And in fact, I went there. I took 2 trips to Brazil just to kind of get a sense of the place. But I'm glad you brought this out. I never thought of that the novels I mentioned are all very deeply rooted in place. Indeed, yes. Yeah, I do like novels with a keen sense of place. And I hope that Silent Winds, Dry Seas does the same.
Hmm.
Yeah.
How do you see where we are shaping who we are?
Oh, how does geography shape us? I think
Hmm.
it's more than geography. I think it's more the cultures around you. I don't think there's one culture around us. There are many cultures, maybe even conflicted cultures we live in. In the case of a Mauritian, for instance, like in my case, I grew up in a Hindu household, but
Hmm.
then you go to school and you mix with Roman Catholics, a few Protestants, Buddhists, and then you expose to those cultures. So, my value system is a value system shaped largely by Hindu values, but also, Judeo-Christian values, which I acquired through my education. And this applies to other Mauritians of other ethnic origins as well. I mean, if Franco-Mauritian would have maybe more of a Judeo-Christian, but he would be exposed to, Hindu and Buddhist values. So in the United States, I mean, maybe 50 years ago, it was more, they used the term when I came to America in 1971, I heard the term WASP,
Mhm.
white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I don't hear that much these days. I'm not sure even that many Americans know what it means today. But now, culturally, I mean, if you grow up in America, it's not just, the main sort of WASP. It's not no longer WASP. It's, there's Latin American culture. There are all the waves of immigration. It's a much more diversified society, diverse society, I mean. So, yeah, we are not just the product of one culture anymore.
Hmm. Um, I'd be happy to take questions from those who are with us tonight. If you want to drop those in the chat, in the Q&A box, we'd be happy to answer them. And while you're thinking of those questions, to back up just a little bit to where we began in terms of themes that you wouldn't ever structure this novel around. But because it's rooted in place, you mentioned, for example, if you wrote a novel about religious depression, it would sound, um, you know, like propaganda. And yet, because it's rooted in place, you can still
Yeah.
explore those. We do have a question here. Did your uncle really take you to a local brothel?
No, it's not an uncle actually. In the novel, it's a cousin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a cousin. No, my uncle took me to bars.
Mm.
Yeah. The attitude to alcohol in Mauritius at that time was very different.
Mm.
If you recall in the scene where the chapter about Cyclone Carol, the shopkeeper gives the narrator the bottle of rum to take home. Now, in the United States, you could be arrested, if you let your nephew or your son, carry a bottle of alcohol out of the shop. But in Mauritius at that time, and I believe still now, if a 13-year-old goes to the shop and buys a bottle of rum or wine, I think probably the shopkeeper will sell it to him. I don't know. They may have changed the rules, but it's a different attitude to alcohol.
Mm.
Mind you, I think the rate of alcoholism in the United States is pretty high in spite of all these restrictions.
There's another comment here that they loved the book and the ending was satisfying, which, When I arrived at the ending, I sort of wanted to know if there's another novel, like maybe this is an Elena Ferrante series. Did you ever consider that?
It could be because it's not a typical Hollywood ending where all the loose ends are tied up, right? It leaves sort of the end. It's hanging in the air. Like, will there be sort of another novel dealing with the adventures of Vishnu in America, right? Since it ends with "Look for America," so that could be a novel, but I'm not sure it'll be as interesting as Silent Winds, Dry Seas. However, there's another idea that came to my mind. What if that uncle who died in Palestine, what if he didn't really die? He shows up, he comes back, the way you have in this French movie, The Return of Martin. What if he comes back and he faces the family? That would be, I think, a more interesting novel. That would really be the world of fiction. So if there is a follow-up, it would be more along those lines. A what if, what, yeah.
Would you ever, by what if, do you mean like an alternative history kind of novel, or?
No, if he comes back and he meets Vishnu and Vishnu's mother, who he was supposed to marry. What kind of feelings would that evoke? What could happen?
Yeah.
How would Vishnu and him get along? How would that affect the relationship? Then it would become a really family novel, an intense one.
That's true. We haven't talked very much about the French culture that is being brought in here. And of course, Mauritius has its own very distinctive thread of that. Could you talk just a little bit about, the role of French and yeah, go ahead.
Though Mauritius has been a British colony from 1810 to 1968, the predominant cultures in Mauritius, the predominant cultural influences in Mauritius are French and Indian. And all the daily newspapers are in French, not in English. There is one weekly newspaper in English. Though the education system is British largely, people speak more French than English. English is the administrative institutional language. And so I sort of show that in the novel by having Vishnu write a poem in French, by showing how the Creole language, how much French there is in that Creole language. So it has had a major impact. When the British took over in 1810, they kind of agreed to keep the French language, customs, as well as the laws. So the legal system in Mauritius now is characterized by the use of the Code Napoleon, which is similar to what you have in Louisiana. So if you go to a court of law in Mauritius, you would have the barrister, plead in English and then quote, go to his to that code and quote in French. So that's the way it is in Mauritius.
We have a question here. Maybe this dovetails into that. Could you speak more to the source of oppression you mentioned? Which religio-cultural influences would you say attributed most to the restrictions you or others may have experienced? How, if all, does tourism impact and influence the culture?
Tourists go to Mauritius and have no idea what the real Mauritius is. they get to the airport, they get into a taxi or a car sent by the hotel, and then they spend 2-3 weeks in the hotel resort. The hotel resort arranges for them to go on tours, and on those tours, the only Mauritians they meet are the Mauritians who are employees of the tour group, and so they get a very distorted picture of Mauritius. Tourists don't really mix that much. Now, there are tourists who don't stay in the major hotels. They stay in bed and breakfast type accommodations. They are more likely to experience kind of the real Mauritius, because these are, small business people who run these hotels. So the impact, tourism has had an impact, and in the eyes of some Mauritians, probably they would say, well, they have had a negative impact on the morality of Mauritius, so which leads back to the issue of what I call social and religious oppression, which is the communities, especially the Hindu and the Muslim community. The Hindu and Muslim communities live by what I consider to be a strict moral code. And that is what I call, and that strict moral code is a patriarchal moral code. It's a code characterized by a double standard, whereby men and boys can do certain things, women can't do certain things. This was, again, I'm talking of the society I grew up in. Probably now things are a little more, more Mauritians are traveling now than before. And you have now the internet, you have the TV, all the channels you have there. So things may be different, but that's what I mean by the this strict moral code, strict the norms, social norms. That's what I mean. Yeah. But believe me, the most tourists don't see that side of the island.
I believe that. A simpler, maybe more complex question, I'm not sure. What is your writing routine?
Well, first, my routine is not a typical writing routine, and I don't think that people should adhere to my routine or any other routine. They should develop their own routine according to their temperament. I have writer friends who kind of write the way you go to work, 9 to 5 or 9 to 4, 9 to 3. In my case, I write by spurts. I can write for a very long time, on and on. I can have 20-hour days if I want to, but then I have days where I don't write. However, that doesn't mean I may not be writing literally, but if I'm walking around, I am thinking. What I am doing is related to my writing. It is. I don't consider it unproductive, not to write, because you are thinking. You are, things are playing in your mind. So the writing routine, my writing routine is not a typical writing routine. Yeah.
I tell my students every time I start teaching, you have to find your own. I can teach you this and this and this, but when it comes down to it, you have to figure out what works for you.
I hope I haven't contradicted what you've been telling them. I mean, but when you have a course and you have a grade at the end of the semester, that's a different matter, But when you're writing a novel, it's Yeah, I believe that you also need time to read.
Mm.
You need time to reflect. You know,
Mhm.
you may write a paragraph, but that paragraph may lead you to a lot of other reflections. It may lead you to kind of a digress. Sometimes it's good to digress. In the end, you may cut it off, but digressions are sometimes, helpful.
Yes, I like to think of space around writing
Yeah.
where I go for walks, both metaphorically and literally, and just wandering. That space is very important, I think, in the writing process. Are there other questions? Any lingering thoughts on this wonderful novel?
Thank you for your kind words.
If
You
anybody here
you
has,
should write a book review.
well, I'd be happy to let, and yeah, if anybody here has not read this novel, please go buy it. Silent Winds, Dry Seas. It's a story unlike one that you've read. It may seem familiar in places as a coming of age story, but as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a coming of age in ways many of us can only imagine. And indeed, as we are all still zooming in from various places, the idea of place and what you've captured here, I think will stick with me. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for being the interlocutor, and thanks to NYU for hosting.
Thank you to everybody for your questions. If you'd like any more information about the book, the link is in the chat, as well as on the NYU DC's website. And thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Oh, someone asked about the book title. I saw there.
Silent Winds, Dry Seas. Good, good, good. I can here.
Thank you now.